All right, in our third video on socialization, we're going to think about the process of socialization itself and how it happens and who socializes us. How do we learn the rules and roads of society? Roads of society, whatever that means. Whatever. So um, in this video, we're going to talk about socialization more generally. Think about what we call implicit and explicit, or kind of hidden and obvious socialization, and who does this. Think a little bit about technology and progress, as well as socialization over the course of our lives. Right. So what is socialization? What are we talking about when we're talking about becoming a self, developing self-consciousness, and functioning in society? Primarily, this is a process of internalizing our culture. You recall from our section on culture, we're talking about language and symbols. We are clearly and explicitly taught what these things mean. We learn to recognize letters. We learn to recognize shapes. And more down the line, we learn to recognize complex series of things like sentences and paragraphs. We learn values and norms. We learn the key beliefs. We are often schooled in things like the Statement of Allegiance in the US, um, which has a set of values and beliefs embedded in it. So all of these processes can be both implicit and explicit. What that means is when something is implied, it's not obvious or clear, but we're still learning. We're still absorbing the message. But explicit socialization is when we are, there's somebody, a group, a person who is, it's clearly their job to teach us the rules and norms and values of society. That is their job, and that is what they're supposed to do in that context. These are explicit agents of socialization. They're also implicit agents of socialization. Agent here just means like an agent at the FBI. These are people whose active role it is to socialize us. Well, so what does that mean, implicit or explicit socialization? Well, I'm sure we're all familiar with something like this. Many of us may have had it um, in kindergarten and elementary school. And in many ways, star charts like these, as we'll see when we get to education, are a kind of implicit and explicit socializer. Now, some of the times we get a star because our teacher teaches us something. We learn a letter, we learn a shape, we learn a rule. But there's also other things we get stars for in there. We get stars for not touching other people. So we get stars for staying in line. We get stars for sharing. Yeah, we get stars for listening, and when we listen, we're being explicitly socialized by the teacher. The teacher is telling us, what do I need to learn about the world? But all of these are also teaching students something. Right? They're teaching about personal space, about how to obey authority, about how to be part of a group. These are more implicit lessons. They're not saying, conform to all authority, though sometimes they might. More primarily, they're saying these are good things. These are things you should value. You should be kind and share. Right? And as you get more stars for that, you learn it's a good thing. You learn what the values of society are, even if it's a little bit less explicit. Right? So we can think of also people who are explicit or implicit socializers. Who's supposed to teach us the rules and norms and stuff of society? And who do we kind of absorb it from? Who do we learn things from that aren't, it's not their job, in other words, to do that? So when we think of explicit socializers, we're talking about our family, first of all. If a child is misbehaving, um, their family isn't doing their job. Right? If they haven't taught them the rules and manners of our society. The education system teaches us lots of things, as we've already seen, how to share, how to behave, how not to touch others, how to respect property. Religion, our religion often serves to teach us um, values, beliefs, uh, how we should be in the world, what's good and right. We're socialized in the workplace. Often we're told exactly how we should behave, what the rules of the road are, how we should act. There's also implicit socializers. It's not really these people's jobs to teach us the rules, but we absorb them through these sources. And here's where our peers, maybe our siblings, and the media become a big part of it. One thing we're going to think about in our discussion this week is how do peer groups for young boys and girls tend to socialize them into gender roles? Often it's other boys and girls who tell us the right and wrongs of how to behave as boys and girls and to call us out if we don't behave as a boy and a girl in the right way. So media are, as we'll see when we study it, are really anything that transmits communication that's not just another person. If they're in front of you, they are immediately in front of you. Media means coming in between. Media socializes for most of our lives. Most of the books that we read as children are teaching us values and ideals about society, as much as they're teaching us maybe how to read, how to act. But there are other less obvious forms of socialization where we learn values that aren't as obvious. Take this orange juice commercial, for example. In a magazine, for those of you not familiar with print media, it's just an orange juice commercial. They're advertising that they have an orange juice thingy with a handle on it. Terrific. But over here on the left, we see that there's also messages about how you should behave as a young woman. That young women should be easy to handle. The young woman on the left doesn't look very nice. She has a glare. She's dressed in sort of business formal attire. The young woman on the right, of course, they're children, but this one has this weird come hither look, has flowers and a dress, is kind of coyly looking over her shoulder. This is telling young women how they should be. This is what how women should act. They should be easy to handle. They shouldn't be formidable in any way. Sometimes these are more explicit, as with the ad on the right. The harder a wife works, the cuter she looks. And these pep vitamins to keep wives working. That day they may have had amphetamines in them. Or look at this simple image in a widely scathed ad from Dove. What is this telling us? What message is this sending us? Is it saying that you're more clean after? And yet we notice that the before and the after, the race of the models changes. The messaging here is actually fairly clear and clearly racist. That whiter skin is cleaner. Messages like this are abound in our society, the implicit socialization going on here. Part of what we want to think about in our class discussion is how does our socialization shape the power relations we have in society. For those of you who may have read W.B. Du Bois's writings on double consciousness, part of what he talks about is that many children are raised in the mainstream ideas and images in our society, but many minority students and children learn also that some of those same rules don't apply to them, that they're treated differently than the mainstream or the norm in society. Part of what we want to think about is when and how do we learn those messages? More examples of advertisements giving us ideas about what's cool, about how men and women should behave, also that we should smoke. The thing about media and socialization is that media are constantly changing. Television, video games, now the internet used to be primarily through books and newspapers. The ideas and values we learn through these change over time. Increasingly, parents are worried about what kids are exposed to on social media and the internet. Many studies show that most boys have experienced some exposure to pornography by the age of 13, for example. These often socialize children into expectations around sex and performing sex, even if anyone who's performed sex knows what goes on in pornography does not resemble reality. The point is that kids don't really know better, and even if they aren't thinking about it, things like pornography are transmitting messages about how sex is supposed to happen, and within that, about how men and women are supposed to behave during sexual acts. This can be very important because much pornography is just made by men and often objectifies women. Many children and teenagers don't really understand that and don't understand that that's not necessarily how sex is supposed to occur. So this is a constantly changing landscape. We see this today with people absorbing messages from racist media, from powerful figures in politics through social media. And society as a whole is trying to get a handle on how do we regulate and balance that. All right, lastly, we want to think of socialization over the life course as we grow old, as we age and change. A couple of key concepts here. One of them is a rite of passage. These are rituals or ceremonies, explicit rituals and ceremonies, sometimes more formal, sometimes less, that are intended to mark a transition from one phase of your life to another. Some of you may have participated, for example, in something like a quinceañera. Bat mitzvahs and bar mitzvahs are much the same thing. They're a ritual transition into adulthood. Birthdays yearly are, but hopefully you all will also go to this thing called a graduation, which celebrates your transition from student to professional and adult. You might think about some less formal, less ritualized ceremonies and think, what's the transition being marked here? What is the movement from one stage of a life to another? Where do we see rites of passage, for example, in Greek life, in sororities and fraternities? As society changes, as we get older, or as we move into different aspects of our life, we often have to be re-socialized. We have to forget old norms and learn new ones. If you were to move to France or Japan right now, you'd have to learn an entirely different set of rules and norms. You might do this through what's called a degradation ceremony. This can be formal or informal, but this is where some of the old rules are stripped away. For example, if you're going to become a soldier, you will often go through basic training. This is a very formal process that they had to do to get soldiers to shoot at other people, because most of our lives we are socialized not to harm and to be kind to others. And to get soldiers to actually shoot people, which for a long time they didn't, they had to strip away those old norms and build new ones. So we see these also in fraternities and sororities. We see these sort of degradation ceremonies, even when people have to leave their family behind and move into an old folks' home, for example. A little less formal there. Resocialization can happen as well when you learn new rules around social media. Learn the new rules of not to put a period at the end of a text because it sounds pissed off. And lastly, we have anticipatory socialization. Every time I tell you to send a formal email, to send something as a Word document, this is exactly what I'm doing because I'm socializing you for the workplace that you're going to be joining once you're a college student. All right. We'll dig into these more in class, get into some examples, and draw on your own experiences in our class meeting together.